essentially I'm just going to be cutting and pasting exactly what I had. I recorded this part of the show 100% finished in terms of my warrant for premise 2, which is about warranting that there is a principle of sufficient reason. Namely, I'm appealing to that as an explanatory principle to overcome the Glendower problem that atheists and skeptics like to bring up as one of the 5 objections they can bring against any traditional cosmological argument. And they're basically, the Glendower problem is, yeah, you have this cosmic fact that the universe exists contingently, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't require an explanation or need a cause or anything like that. And obviously, since the universe is contingent, we're going to be answering that Glendower objection by positing a principle of sufficient reason, our explanatory principle that says, yes, everything that exists needs a sufficient reason or explanation for its existence. And that explanation is going to be, as we'll see in premise 3, is God, or the God one hypothesis, as we're going to explanatory hypothesis there. So that's the plan of action. Yeah, I'm just gonna get straight into it. I recorded lots of this show 2 years ago, back in the summer of the first season of Skeptics and Seekers, when I was the Christian co-host. So yeah, I didn't really do any editing on this front, or add-ons like I've done with some of the other ones or older ones where I said things wrong or got it a little bit messed up and stuff like that. Anyways, yeah, so yeah, I'm just gonna literally copy and paste what I've had 100%. So let's do that now. So enjoy the show. So yeah, let's move on to the second premise, and this is where our use of a general explanatory principle comes in to overcome the Glendower problem and partly the infinite regress problem as well. But remember, premise 2 is our principle of sufficient reason. And the way we've defined the principle of sufficient reason is every quote-unquote existing thing, remember we define what that means, has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And this is, again, this premise is relatively uncontroversial. Most rational people just know it's obvious and it's self-evident, they know it's true and that sort of thing. Matt Dillahunty, the famous atheist, he doesn't deny this. He says, of course, this is true. But this is slightly more controversial than, or more complex than the first premise in terms of how we can warrant this premise. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this and how we warrant this principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so we've seen if this premise is true or warranted, i.e. is sound, then this effectively neutralizes the Glendower problem, because it provides a general explanatory principle whereby we would expect existing things, like the universe, to have explanations, or to demand or call for explanations. Remember Glendower calling to the ghosts, but there aren't actually any ghosts that come. Well, in this case, our principle of sufficient reason is what allows us to not be like Glendower. Not only does the universe call for an explanation, it actually has an explanation. So that's what this principle of sufficient reason is attempting to do. However, before we get into the evaluating the soundness, is it true that this principle of sufficient reason, that there is a principle of sufficient reason? We first need to make a quick definitional note, because notice how we've stated the principle of sufficient reason. There are different versions, depending on which person you're looking at, different versions of the principle of sufficient reason that one can use in a Leibnizian cosmological argument. And ours is stated, remember, everything, quote-unquote thing, that's the operative word, that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the internal necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. So that's our particular definition. And there are different definitions that come into play here. So in the first place, there are different versions of the principle of sufficient reason, some stronger than others. And ours is very much a weak or modest version of the principle of sufficient reason compared to others. So, for example, Leibniz himself had a very strong, unsustainable, and I would even say possibly falsified version of the principle of sufficient reason, whereby he said every fact, both necessary, so a fact is a proposition that is true. That's how we're defining a fact. Every fact or true proposition has an explanation of its existence. So that includes necessary truths and contingent truths. And subsequent to Leibniz, a lot of atheists and Christians, Peter van Inwagen has created an effective argument, I think. He's a Christian philosopher that refutes or falsifies this strong or at least makes the very strong version that Leibniz gives problematic. And this was the version that Dr. William Lane Craig rejected, for example, when he heard it. This is because of the strength of Leibniz's principle. Oh, it's unsustainable. And there are objections to that. I'll see if I can. I'll try to provide a source from Peter van Inwagen, or I'll mention his argument against that. But effectively, it makes everything necessary. We have some sort of modal fatalism at play if this is the principle. So I'm pretty sure this principle is falsified. We can't use the principle of sufficient reason defined in the way that Leibniz did. However, there are other modern philosophers. Alexander Proust maintains a strong version of the principle of sufficient reason, but he modifies it by slightly weakening it. And he says, well, instead of saying every fact or every true proposition has an explanation of its existence, he says merely that every contingent fact or every contingent true proposition has an explanation of its existence. Again, there are issues on that, but I think Alexander Proust argues effectively and proves his case using his version of the principle of sufficient reason. Again, you can see this in the sources that I provide, that I'm providing you, so you can read how he proves this himself and his different versions. So he provides one PSR that every contingent truth or contingent fact has an explanation of its existence. And this avoids and circumvents some of the problems that Peter van Inwagen and other philosophers have raised against Leibniz's very strong, radically strong version of it that includes necessary and contingent truths. However, our principle is actually even weaker than Alexander Proust's definition. I use that not because, I don't think Alexander Proust's stronger version is true. I do think that's true. And our version, as a weaker version, is perfectly compatible and consistent with Proust's stronger version of it. I think he's right. The principle of sufficient reason he gives is correct as well. But it's not it leads to unnecessary disputes and things that are not necessary to make a successful Leibnizian cosmological argument. So I'm just being pragmatic in saying, sure, I can prove that the strong Proust principle of sufficient reason is true, and Alexander Proust has done that himself, or he's already done the legwork on that front, but I don't have to do that. So why pick a fight with a skeptic if I don't need to? I'm just merely going to argue that everything, every substance, forget about propositions, I don't want to get into realism or anti-realism debates. Are numbers or propositions, are they necessarily existent things that exist or not? Our version of the principle of sufficient reason says I don't have to get into that debate. Who cares? Whatever it is, my principle, whichever is the case on that front, my principle will apply and is consistent with a realist or an anti-realist position. If numbers and propositions turned out to be things that exist, beautiful. If you take an anti-realist position, no, they're not things, they're imaginary. Like William Lane Craig is an anti-realist, whereas I'm a divine conceptualist. I am a realist, my own opinion. My principle is so modest, it doesn't take a position. It doesn't matter what stance on that is true, it still applies. Either numbers and propositions are things and therefore they require an explanation, or if they're not things, then maybe they require an explanation, maybe they don't. I don't care. I'm just focused on things. Things or substances require an explanation of their existence, and that's all we need to make the argument work. Now also note that with our version of the our definition of the principle of sufficient reason, there are even weaker versions than what we have here, because our version says that there's an explanation either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause, in the case of contingent beings or entities. So basically our argument makes a distinction between two different types of entities. There are necessary beings. So God is traditionally said to be a necessary being, and that's what this argument is going to be trying to prove. Platonists, who are realists or strong realists, I disagree with them, but they also think abstract objects like numbers or propositions are real things that exist necessarily, and pretty much everyone exists. Even anti-realists would admit if numbers and propositions are in fact things that exist, then they would exist necessarily. And then contingent things are things that could not have existed. They don't exist in all logically possible worlds, even if they exist in some possible worlds. So human beings, it's possible I couldn't have been born. I might not have been born. The planet Earth might not have existed. That's a contingent being. So these are the two types of things that our argument is trying to go for. And there's a weakened version of the principle of sufficient reason that we could use if there's some controversy about necessary beings, because we don't really know a lot about how do explanations for necessary truths or necessary things like number, assuming a realist position, a necessary thing like a number or true propositions or something like that, facts. How do explanations for that work? And we don't have a genuinely clear understanding of how that would work. But I actually don't think that is an issue, though. So yeah, if that is an issue for the skeptic that you're dealing with, you could give a watered-down premise, say, okay, fine, forget about necessary, things existing out of the necessity of their own nature. At the very least, every contingent thing, every contingent substance has an explanation of its existence, i.e. through an external cause. And that would be relatively uncontroversial, or at the very least less controversial for a skeptic accepting your PSR. But again, I'm going to stick with the more stronger version because I don't have a problem with necessity. In the first place, we don't really have a full explanatory understanding of how explanations of contingent things exist. We don't have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions to explain how contingent explanations work for contingent things. We know some things about it, but not a heck of a lot. So I advance what's called a position called particularism as opposed to methodism. So traditional classical theists like Rene Descartes or John Locke, they like methodism. You have to first have a set of necessary, sufficient conditions, and then you use those conditions to identify, oh, well, this is a cat, this is a dog, because you check off the list of criteria or conditions for being a dog or being a cat or whatever. I don't think reality works that way. I advance particularism. So I think we can properly basically know what a cat is, what a dog is in certain clear cases. And then we use those clear cases to develop criteria after the fact, certain helpful criteria that can help us adjudicate certain gray zones. Is this a dog or a cat, or it's a hybrid? So it's the other way around, and this is a version called particularism, and I think that makes sense of the world, and that would avoid this issue of the skeptics. Yeah, the issue applies to contingent things. We obviously know what love is and stuff like that, even if we don't have a set of necessary sufficient conditions for that. And secondly, there's no problem in necessity. It's just, look, necessity explains itself through the necessity of its own nature. So things that are necessary because of axiom S4 logic. Axiom S4 logic is a necessary truth because it is necessary out of a necessity of its own nature, and so on and so forth. It's a regress. There's this potentially infinite regress or circular reasoning. Circularly explanatory, or is an explanatory regress. Is that a problem? No, because there are different types of regresses. It's not the case that, it's an infinite regress or circular reasoning, therefore it's bad. No, not necessarily. There are different types. There are viciously circular arguments, or there are vicious infinite regresses. And we're going to be trying to refute vicious infinite regresses when we get to the infinite regress problem later on. But there are also helpful or proper infinite regresses or circular explanatory models or reasoning, and these aren't necessarily problematic at all. There is this distinguishing between them. So I actually don't have a problem, and that's why I'm including the necessity, keeping in that fact that there are necessary things and there are contingent things. Okay, so a second objection here that some skeptics, actually it was a Christian, and this was raised to Dr. William Lane Craig, and they said, look, and also it's in the video with Matt Dillahunty. Now, just before I get into that, though, I'm going to include, so with the particularism versus skepticism or Methodism, I'm going to provide a source from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the problem of criteria. So you can read that, find that in the sources, and get sort of a sense of what that is about. What am I talking about here to overcome that objection about using the explanatory model of something being necessary out of something existing of the necessity of its own nature. But there's also a second objection here, and they say, look, William Lane Craig, the version of our argument provides an artificial bifurcation of things. It loads things into necessary beings and contingent beings, but that's artificially narrow, because actually there aren't just two types of things, there are at least four types of things, according to some skeptics. So they'll say, number one, there are things that are internally necessary, or necessary independent beings. So that's the first horn of our thing, right? Things exist necessarily out of the necessity of their own nature. And that's what we're going to be arguing God is, or our first cause, or our ultimate explanation is a internally necessary or necessary independent being. But there's also a second type of necessary being that this argument just totally overlooks. Necessary dependent beings. So these are beings that are necessary, but they don't exist by the necessity of their own nature. They're actually they're caused externally by something. So, for example, I believe in necessary moral truths. Moral values and duties are necessary, true propositions or facts. Some Platonist philosophers or realist philosophers will say that numbers and sets and abstract objects exist necessarily. They are things that exist necessarily. But traditionally, Christians don't like that. They don't want an infinite sea of a bunch of necessary beings, necessary independent beings. So they'll say, okay, well, sure, necessary. There are necessary things like sets, numbers, propositions, moral truths and values, but they are necessary dependent being because their explanation is in an external cause, the second horn. They are caused by the necessary independent being, God. Again, that gets into the realist, anti-realist debate. I'm a divine conceptualist, so I don't believe that there are necessarily... I believe that numbers and necessary moral truths and stuff are necessary dependent beings in the sense that they are mental objects. I don't believe there are any abstract objects. Abstract objects aren't things that exist. Like there isn't the number one floating inside God's head. The number one is a thought in the mind of God. So it's a mental object. But there are also people like William Lane Craig who are anti-realists and say, no, these things just don't exist. There are no necessary dependent beings. Whereas realists will say, no, there are these necessary beings, but they're dependent on another necessary being, a necessary independent being, i.e. the mind of God or God in some way, caused by God out of necessity. So there's those two differences. Then there's also the normal contingent beings that are contingently caused in an external cause. That's the universe, that's the planets, me, dogs, chairs, that sort of thing. But another skeptic said, well, there's also a fourth one. There are contingent independent beings. William Lane Craig responds to this, and I'm going to provide this in the sources. This is one of his Q&As for the week, and I think William Lane Craig responds quite correctly to this. So he deals with, whether there are necessary dependent beings or not, doesn't matter. That still qualifies under the second horn, right? Because that is something that is explained via an external cause, via a necessary independent being. And necessary dependent beings are caused by necessary independent beings, i.e. God. So that doesn't matter. External contingent dependent beings, again, that's what we've been talking about. That qualifies in an external cause, a necessary independent being, God. Now the final category, contingent independent beings, there's no such thing. This is logically absurd and impossible. This is a fancy way of saying it's a self-cause. There are contingently self-caused things, and that's logically impossible. You cannot pick yourself up by your own cosmic bootstraps. That you cannot cause yourself to come into existence if you're contingent, as a contingent object. So that category doesn't exist. There are only three types of things, and they are perfectly consistent with our statement of the bifurcated principle of sufficient reason. They're either necessary. Everything that exists has an explanation of existence, either in the necessity of its own nature, necessary independent beings, God, or in an external cause, necessary dependent beings potentially like abstract objects or propositions, numbers, and contingent external or contingent dependent beings like planets, the universe, Dale Glover, and that sort of thing. So yeah, the premise defeats this objection. The way Stephen T. Davis has stated it, and William Lane Craig has used it, it covers all the bases. There isn't any obfuscation here, or there isn't they haven't missed out on anything. That this premise is able to cover all of the various types of things or beings that exist. That's the final objection in terms of clarifying about our premise. So yeah, let's get straight into it. Is there this principle of sufficient reason? How do we know that we're warranted in saying that our version of the PSR is in fact true? And to that effect, we're going to break it up again into various positive and negative evidences, assign normative probability or subjective normative probability values to each of those factors, plug it into Bayes to get a cumulative case, and that's going to tell us, is there in general a PSR that applies to existing things in general? And that's in general. Now note, there's also the second aspect. After we've established that there is a PSR that applies generally to existing things, some skeptics may try to say, okay, well, sure, there's a PSR that exists for existing things, but not for the particular existing thing you're arguing for, not for the existence of the universe. Oh, that's an exception. We are justified in having an exception or an exemption to the general explanatory principle. So yeah, that's what we're going to have to look at. We have to demonstrate and warrant two aspects here for this premise to be successful. One, that there is a principle of sufficient reason that applies to existing things in general, and secondly, that general explanatory principle of sufficient reason applies in the particular case of what we're trying to explain, i.e. the existence of the universe in particular. So that's what you can look forward to. So that's what we'll be doing. Let's get into it. Okay, so the very first line of evidence is one that I've used in the past with people like Andrew and Matt Taylor and David Johnson, is my good old favorite friend, the properly basic belief. And additionally, it's also self-evident that the principle of sufficient reason is true in the way that I've defined it. It does generally apply to existing things. Everything that I can think of has an explanation. It's just obvious and known in a properly basic way that the principle of sufficient reason is generally true. In the 100% degree, there's zero doubt in my mind. I'm absolutely certain that the PSR, as I've defined it, exists in general. And further, it's also a double whammy, because with aspect 2, I'm also 99 to 99.99% warranted via a properly basic belief and its self-evidence that the PSR, as I've defined it, applies in the particular case of the universe. So this is the first positive reason to believe that there is a PSR, and further, as a double whammy, it this principle also applies in the case of the universe in particular. Now, there are a couple of objections that skeptics or PSR denying skeptics will, of course, want to raise. And that's the fact, well, I don't have this properly basic belief, or I don't see the PSR as being self-evident. So in the first place, I just have to say, well, that's your fault and your problem. That's not my problem. I'm warranted in believing it's true, whether you have a properly basic belief in that regard or not. I don't really care what you have or not. That's your fault and your issue. So you can reply that way. You're warranted just because there are counterfeit. So just because somebody else doesn't claim to have it, doesn't mean that you're not warranted in having a properly based belief. It's a subjective evidence. Only you know if you truly have a warranted true belief or not through this mechanism. Now, one thing I just want to say, sometimes skeptics are too hasty. They're just desperate to try and reject the premise. So they'll say, well, I don't have it. But there are reasons. So David Hume, for example, was one such skeptic. He denied that the PSR was self-evident, and he was responding to Leibniz's version, so the strong version in particular, not ours. But he's saying, no, I don't have a properly based belief, or it's not self-evident to me. And what's more, he actually affirmed other propositions as being self-evident to him that contradict our version of the PSR and stronger versions of the PSR. So, this philosophical confusion and disagreement, how do we explain that or address that? And the first way is actually, look, it's the job of philosophy to make sure we clarify our terms. So, in the first place, it's not clear that people like David Hume, for example, actually deny the PSR as we understand it, or the PSR properly. David Hume, for example, had this weird mistaken notion that constant correlation was the same as causation. It's not. He screwed up. That's totally wrong. We have to make sure that the PSR denier, actually understands what they're talking about and what they're denying. And they have to clarify their terms and say, well, why do you reject it? Are there any hidden reasons, or do you have a misunderstanding of the terminology in the first place? So that's one thing that you could do to try and help a PSR denier, and understand. A second objection is the fact that there are so many counterfeit claims to properly based beliefs or self-evident propositions and truths, right? David Hume himself said, no, I think this proposition is self-evident, and that even contradicts your PSR. But again, because properly basic beliefs and or self-evidence, this is a subjective line of evidence, you and you alone are warranted in keeping that regardless of the counterfeit claims. I don't care how many false claims there are to properly basic beliefs. That's totally irrelevant to me. I don't believe you, skeptic. I believe me because I'm, through basic introspection, I'm aware of what I know to be true, and I don't have that power to know what you know to be true in a properly basic way or self-evident. In a self-evident way. So these are two ways you can respond there. And just be aware that the reason why these skeptics, they may be telling the truth. They're not necessarily lying or necessarily having a misunderstanding. It could be that they sincerely don't have a properly basic belief or don't see the PSR as being self-evident to them in the way most rational people do. And that could be explained on a Christian perspective because of sin. The noetic or cognitive, their cognitive faculties are now defunct in various ways. The atheist is defunct in various ways because of the noetic effects of the fall. And every human being, even Christians, are still affected by that. Our spirits were affected, our emotions, our cognitive abilities in various ways and to differing degrees. So yeah, people aren't all in the same state, and that's perfectly understandable from a Christian theistic perspective. So it could be that these skeptics don't actually have a properly based belief or see the PSR as being self-evident. However, in addition to what we're saying, I think that we can do something to maybe perhaps spur the skeptic to see if they truly don't have a properly basic belief or truly don't see it as self-evident. And what I'm going to do is appeal to 4 different cases, and these A couple of these actually qualify as separate arguments for the truth of the PSR in general that I'm arguing for. But the way I'm going to use them is just as pragmatic arguments that can kind of spur the PSR denying skeptic to see, you know what, yeah, I do see the PSR as being true in a properly basic way, or it is self-evident. Once I go through these examples, yeah, you're right. I do see that there is this principle. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use specific examples that are designed to be problematic for the atheist or the PSR denying typical skeptic. So, you know, they're not going to want to deny that the PSR is true with these examples. So my first pragmatic example here is based on an argument. Look, the abandonment of methodological naturalism in science. We all know how much atheists and skeptics love clinging on to their methodological naturalism. No supernatural miracles, we can't have that. That's a ridiculous explanation. How many times have we heard that nonsense? But yeah, okay, Mr. Skeptic, if you deny the general truth of a PSR or a principle of sufficient reason, then guess what? You have no business holding to methodological naturalism. No, we're perfectly able to settle for easy supernatural explanations. God of the gaps, let's do it. I've got no reason not to. The heck with science. That's a waste of time and hard work. I'm just going to go, God did it. Thor did this. Zeus did this. Without the PSR, there isn't any way to try to maintain a devotion in science to methodological naturalism, which we all know is the correct way to do science. Even Christian theists accept this. They reject metaphysical naturalism. That's complete nonsense. But they do adopt methodological naturalism in doing science. And it's accepted. Part of the justification for accepting that assumes that there has to be a principle of sufficient reason along the lines of what I've defined it above. Because, you know, think of it this way. If you want to come back to this and say, no, we don't need a PSR, we're just saying scientists are using methodological naturalism because we're arguing just this is what natural phenomena are typically explanations. You know, they're the typical explanations. That's all we're saying. But as I said, yeah, without the PSR, you have serious problems. We have no way to measure the quote-unquote typicality of natural versus supernatural events. You have no reason to prefer one type of explanation over another. So as Alexander R. Proust puts it, he says it this way, quote-unquote, as long as there is any chance that something could happen for no cause at all or no explanation, right? No principle of sufficient reason, there are no sufficient explanations or causes. Things can just happen inexplicably. Then Proust continues, given the infinity of possible events, we would expect chance, supernatural, and even altogether inexplicable events to be often realized contrary to observation. This doesn't happen. So here's the first pragmatic example. This should trigger within you PSR denying skeptics to go, hey, no, I accept methodological naturalism and I'm rational in doing that. And if you do, then that means you accept the principle of sufficient reason. Otherwise, you have no epistemic right to maintain methodological naturalism in science. Here's another pragmatic argument that should spur or trigger a properly basic belief or the fact that the PSR is in fact self-evident in general, self-evidently true in general. We would have to abandon our senses, our sense data, and again, all of science out the window. This is an argument from Dr. Robert C. Coons, for example, and he was basically saying, look, without the PSR, forget about Rene Descartes' demon deceiving us or hallucinations or illusions. Without the PSR, it's entirely possible that our perceptual states are just produced inexplicably for no reason at all. It's not that they're explained by a malfunction. No, they just come up without any bearing or any reason to come up. And yeah, this is problematic. Doesn't this trigger? No, there has to be a principle of sufficient reason. If I'm seeing something that's not there, so, you know, obviously in science, if I'm seeing something, it's because there's light, photons, blah, 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 and we know the scientific explanation for that. Or even if there's nothing there and it's a hallucination, well, that still fits the principle of sufficient reason. There's a sufficient reason for the malfunction of my cognitive and sight faculties so that I'm seeing something that's not there. But these all assume the principle of sufficient reason. Perceptual states don't just come about uncaused or inexplicably. And if we deny the PSR, you would have to say, well, we would expect to see that happening all the time. We couldn't trust anything we see or touch or sense in any way. A third pragmatic argument is, look, without the PSR, you would have to abandon all of ethics and morality. Geez, I know how much you skeptics love to pretend you're morally superior to Christians and say, look at this in the Bible, I'm morally outraged, this is terrible, and slavery is bad, and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what, Mr. Skeptic? If you deny the PSR, shut your mouth. You're not allowed to dare judge Christians because you have no base. Not only can I deny that you just have no logical grounding or foundation to ground necessary moral truths, but without the PSR, you've got nothing. It's just, there's a moral truth with the example of, it's moral to switch a cart, a trolley, to save 5 people, but switch it onto a track where you kill 1. But by the same token, it's not moral to kill 1 person for the sake of giving their organs and saving 5 people that need it before they die. What's the difference? There's a moral truth or moral fact there that applies and differentiates the two. Without the PSR, you have no reason to adjudicate that. Our moral senses or moral facts could inexplicably change on a dime. It's wrong to torture today, but 5 minutes from now, oh, it's cool. It's now a moral duty. Let's get out there and start killing people and torturing people. If you don't want to abandon ethics or morality, then you have to accept that there is a PSR in general that applies to these things. And then my final example, I know that you skeptics are going to love this, an abandonment of evolution. Oh no, because that's your beloved masterpiece to try and escape intelligent design or creation arguments or teleological arguments for the existence of God, right? Without your beloved evolution, as Richard Dawkins says, you lose your ability to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So, let's say I came along and said the human species and their various biological features. What explains that? And I just said, I don't know. One day, an ape walked into a swamp and inexplicably outwalked a human being, a fully developed human being. Obviously, you skeptics would laugh at me as being totally ignorant. But without the PSR, actually, you deserve to be the one laughed at because you don't have the right to dare insist that there is an explanation. There's nothing wrong with a human being just inexplicable, an ape going into the swamp and outwalks a human being for no reason at all. The reason for the flaw in logic is, look, let's use a comparative parallel example whereby, let's say your professor, he can reason inductively that because he knows that all the colleagues whose pets he is familiar with or who knows, they have dogs. And since he knows many of his colleagues' pets, therefore every single one of his colleagues has a dog. This is obviously logically fallacious because all you are justified in inferring in this case is that every colleague who has a pet has a dog, not that every colleague has a dog. But evolution, it takes, without the PSR, the evolutionary argument, the argument that no, all biological organisms and their features have a neo-Darwinian naturalistic mechanisms that are responsible for it. And we all derive common descent, we all derive from one common ancestor and stuff like that. Without the PSR, you don't have the right to make that logical inference because you are making the exact same type of argument that I did with the professor's colleagues and his dogs. Basically, you're reasoning or inferring based on a small, biased sample. I mean, just the things that we know about and have studied is just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of all the biological organisms and their features and the various biological features that have existed throughout the 4.6 billion years that the planet Earth has been around, and the 3.8 billion years since the first life forms came about according to modern contemporary science. So you're committing the same logical fallacy based on a biased sample and then inferring something that is not logically justified based on that, unless you're able to use a PSR, principle of sufficient reason, to bridge that gap and say, well, in the case of evolutionary or scientific explanations, we are able to make that leap and say that no, it's not just we don't just infer just the biological organisms for which we know have explanations are explained through naturalistic evolutionary means, but no, every organism is explained through naturalistic evolutionary means. And you need a principle of sufficient reason to do that. So yeah, these are the four pragmatic arguments that I wanted to provide you. And you know, when it comes to a properly basic belief or the self-evident nature of the principle of sufficient reason, as I said, these are hard to get across if you're talking to a skeptic who just doesn't have these. But I wanted to provide these pragmatic examples that could serve as triggers. And maybe you're sitting there as a skeptic and you go, you know what, yeah, I believe in evolution, so I obviously believe there's a PSR there. I believe in methodological naturalism. I believe in ethics. I think it's wrong to torture people. Then yeah, you've got to admit there's a principle of sufficient reason along the lines that I've defined. Yeah, that should trigger a properly basic belief and show you that it is indeed self-evident. Hopefully. Okay, let's move on to the second argument that I want to address, and this I call the God remnant argument. With the properly basic belief in self-evident, as I said, I'm 100% convinced that there's a PSR in general, and it's a double whammy, so I'm 99% warranted in saying that that general principle also applies to the universe. So that's aspect 1 and 2 that I get through this line of evidence. For me personally, you will have your own normative probability values. That's fine. Assign the degree of warrant that you think you have based on that line of evidence and plug it in, and then we'll move on and we'll find out what the overall total is for each person. But moving on to the second argument. So this is what I call the God remnant argument. So this argument basically says, look, given the fact that God exists, then obviously the PSR is true, because God is defined minimally as a maximally great being. He has divine aseity. He is the creator and sustainer of all things. Everything was created and sustained by God. So obviously it logically follows, if God exists, then yep, the principle of sufficient reason along the lines that you've defined it, Dale, is in fact true. Great. Bada boom, bada bing. We proved it, right? No, not quite. So obviously skeptics are probably screaming. The PSR denying skeptics are saying, well, this is viciously circular reasoning, Dale. You know, you're assuming the only reason you would accept the truth of the PSR premise, is because you already accept the conclusion that God exists, and you're using the acceptance of that conclusion to prove that the premise is true. That is a circular argument. It's logically fallacious. Well, not quite. There's some nuance here. So opening up your listening ears and pay attention. This is important. So basically, in terms of how we warrant God existing, we can warrant this from different avenues. An ontological argument, a teleological argument, or we know that God exists in a properly basic way through our sensus divinitatis, or God's sense. And then perhaps, and then we derive from that the PSR is true. Great, that's perfectly reasonable. But here's what this argument is about. This argument is not so much for theists, but for skeptics or atheists. Because let's say you are an atheist now. You've lost your knowledge that God exists, but there may be a remnant that still pertains, whereby you still know the PSR is true. You've forgotten how you derived that knowledge, but nonetheless, you still know that the principle of sufficient reason is true. This avoids the circular reasoning fallacy for you guys, because you don't accept the conclusion in the first place, but you still have this knowledge that was gained based on a forgotten bit of knowledge that you now no longer accept. And there's an example that illustrates how this is logically valid. So let's pretend I go to a hotel room and it's the number 314. And I want to memorize that I was in room 314 for whatever reason. And to help me do that, I say, okay, well, I will remember, I derive from my knowledge through my senses. I see the room number, it's 314, and I derive from that, okay, and memorize that my room number is the same as the first three digits of pi. Now let's say over 5 years go by, and I totally forgotten what my room number was through my sense data of seeing it and knowing that it was the number 314. I've lost that knowledge. But I still remember that, oh, but my room number was the same as or identical to the first three digits of pi. Then I can derive back and go, well, the first three digits of pi are 314. Therefore, I know that my room was number 314. This isn't really an additional source of warrant. This is just allowing you to regain the lost knowledge that you had originally, based on a remnant of knowledge that you have from your original knowledge base that has now been forgotten. So that's how this argument works. I'm not going to personally assign anything to this because I am a Christian theist, and I want to avoid any false charges of circular reasoning on my part. But if you're a skeptic or an atheist, I think about this. If you're someone that formerly believed in God, and maybe you just know that the PSR or principle of sufficient reason is true, but it's not a properly basic belief, or it's not self-evident to you. You have this knowledge, but you have a sense that it's derived based on something, or it's derived from your knowledge of God, your former knowledge of God. But you just can't deny that this aspect is true. You're allowed to use that and apply this argument in that case. Okay, so let's move on to the third argument that proves the general truth of the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. And this has been termed, there are a couple, there are different types, but the main category, this is known as the epistemological argument. It makes epistemology impossible, and with respect specifically to probability. So this is Anthony 6.6, Val or Andrew, I know you're knowledgeable about this, and I'm talking statistical probability or frequency probability, the type that you guys like. So pay attention to this. Now, I have to be honest here and upfront. I'm not sure I totally understand this argument 100%. So maybe if one of you guys, Anthony 6.6 or Andrew or Val, if you guys hear this, maybe if you don't mind leaving a comment and just sort of explaining it a bit. I also provide some sources. This is presented by Bruce in the part 1 video on YouTube. You'll see the bit about this probability type argument. But before I get into that, so there are different versions. So there is one that it makes inference to the best explanation impossible. There is no such thing as a best explanation. How do you the way that works, you have explanatory power, scope, ad hocness, or simplicity, stuff like that, in order to help you infer, and that's relative to various comparisons. But now if you're also comparing it to inexplicable events that just come uncaused out of nothing, how do you derive what the best explanation is? I mean, coming out inexplicably without explanation, well, that's the simplest hypothesis, but it just totally lacks explanatory power, for example. So it just makes any kind of probability judgments in this regard impossible. Inductive reasoning or inferring abductively what the best explanation is. But the argument that I want to get into is specifically about probability. So here's how it works. So in the first place, probability is impossible without the general truth of the principle of sufficient reason. And it comes down to, well, how does statistical or frequency probabilities work? Well, let's say we have a two-headed coin, and you flip it 100 times, or even an infinitely many times. Well, what's the probability that you'll get heads out of all those times you flip it? And it's 1/2. That's generally the frequency that we would expect, or what's called the quote-unquote limiting frequency. We would get heads half the time out of all the flips, or 50% of the time. The number of outcomes divided by the total number of possible outcomes that could occur. Now with probability, though, there's an assumption that goes in, and that assumption requires a PSR to work, right? Because in the first place, we get the limiting frequency, and then we derive a probability from that, and that's usually done through applying what's called the Strong's law of large numbers. And this states that, look, the limiting frequency of large numbers, like flipping a coin infinite number of times or a billion trillion times or something like that, so long as they're independent outcomes, that equals the actual probability of the outcome. And some philosophers of math will question that, but most rational people don't. They make that linkage to the probability of the outcome is actually the same as the limiting frequency for large numbers of independent outcomes. So that's good. Now here's the problem. Here's why it doesn't work with doing probabilities, because the SLLN, or strong law of large numbers, has an assumption that is based or derives from the PSR. It needs to assume that the outcome is quote unquote measurable relative to the underlying probability measure. Without the PSR, it's not measurable. It's totally non-measurable, and it would just be chaos. So here's what it would lead to. Maybe you flip the coin in the first 100 million times you flip it, you get a heads 8 out of every 10 times, and then the next 100 million times you flip it, you get it 4 out of every 10 times, and the limiting frequencies will be randomly changing without any sufficient reason to link the limiting frequencies to an actual probability of occurrence. How do we know it's going to stay 1/2 each one of the times? Now here's the part where I get a little confused here. So this is the part I want the mathematicians in the audience to maybe sort of explain a bit. This is actually false. It's actually even worse than what I just said, because the limiting frequencies are totally non-measurable. And without the PSR, it actually means that the limiting frequency is quote unquote maximally non-measurable. So you can't even say anything about the likelihood. You can't even say that for the first 5 minutes it was 8 out of every 10 times was heads, and then for the next 20 minutes it was 2 out of every 10 times. You can't even say that. It's just maximally non-measurable. You can't get a probability at all to say anything about the likelihood or improbability of hypotheses, and therefore you can't use empirical frequency observations to prove anything. Yeah, that's sort of the argument there in terms of probability and how it works. As I said, check it out in the sources. I didn't include this aspect of my calculation, even though I know it's successful, just because I wasn't 100% sure of how we got to the fact that it's maximally non-measurable. I believe absolutely that is the case, mathematically speaking, and I'm sure Anthony66 and those guys will be able to explain it in the comments if they listen to this. But there it is. That's the argument from probability. Without a PSR, the limiting frequencies, the 1 out of every 2 flips, is impossible to measure. Therefore, probability out the window. But obviously, probability works. So that proves there must be a principle of sufficient reason in general. Bada boom, bada bing. Okay, the next argument, our fourth argument here. This is one William Lane Craig likes to use, and I think is really strong. I'm 99.99% warranted in believing that a principle of sufficient reason exists in general based on this argument. And it's basically the simple argument. Well, I observe the world every day, and I never, not once, do I see widespread PSR violations. Why aren't unicorns or two-headed giraffes or rhinoceroses or ice cream cones or $10 million checks made payable to Dale Glover just popping in and out of existence all the time, ex nihilo? Without a principle of sufficient reason, there's just no reason why anything and everything wouldn't be popping in and out of existence all the time. But our observational experience proves actually no, that's not the case. Anything and everything does not pop in and out of existence all the time in our world. This proves that there must be a general principle of sufficient reason that explains why there's this constraint on reality of things popping in and out of existence. So that's a simple argument. That's one used by William Lane Craig in all of his debates, where he uses the Leibnizian cosmological argument, and it's a very, very strong one, 99.99% proven for me, just based on that alone. And I think This argument will convince most rational people that are being fair and open-minded to truth. Okay, the last positive argument for the truth of a principle of sufficient reason in general is one that I think is one based on modality. I call this the nature of modality argument, and it's actually a reductio ad absurdum argument. So it says, look, if we deny that there's a principle of sufficient reason, it leads to a logical contradiction, and it's logically, therefore it reduces down to logical absurdity. Therefore, there has to be a principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is a necessary truth. Just in terms of definitions, just to give people a quick crash course in modal logic and some of these terminologies, some of the terminology that we'll be using. When we say that something is logically necessary in modal terminology, so a basic definition is it cannot be prevented from existing. It's impossible for that thing not to exist. And in modal logic terminology, we would say that means that something exists in every single logically possible world. For something to be contingent, that means that it is possible to prevent that thing from coming into existence, or if it's a proposition, from that proposition being true. So it can exist in some possible worlds, but it doesn't exist in all possible worlds. That means you're contingent and you're coherent or logically possible. And then finally, there's logically impossible things like a married bachelor or a square circle, where it's impossible for them to exist. So they don't exist in any logically possible world. And what is a logically possible world? Basically, it's a maximum or a maximal set of propositions that are either true or false relative to our actual world. So there's a logically possible world in which Dale is wearing a white shirt right now as I'm recording this. In the actual world, that's false. I'm not wearing a white shirt right now. But it's still logically possible. So there are some possible worlds, or there's a set of maximal set of propositions where it's true that Dale is wearing a white shirt at this moment. So sometimes I think skeptics get confused here. Just understand, a logically possible world it's a quote-unquote abstract entity. It's not a concrete thing. We're not saying that the multiverse is real, or an infinite multiverse is real, or something like that. No, we're in the same way that sets of numbers exist. That's what a logically possible world is. It's simply a set of a maximal set, all the propositions that are true or false within that set relative to our actual world. And that doesn't take a position on realism or anti-realism. If you think sets are things, you take a realist position, great. If you don't, it doesn't matter. I'm happy if you're an anti-realist and you don't think abstract sets are actual things, that's fine. In whatever sense they exist, this argument will work. Remember, our argument or version of the PSR only applies to everything that exists. So every logically possible world that is actualized. If you take an anti-realist position, some possible worlds are not actualized, right? They don't actually exist or have a concrete form. Whereas some scientists, if you take an infinite multiverse view, then every logically possible world actually exists, and it comes into that instancing or belonging relation in terms of various properties or propositions contained within that set, the propositions in that set. So hopefully that sort of makes a bit more sense in terms of definitions, what we're talking about here. Another quick clarification point to understand this argument. So now we understand the difference between something being logically necessary, something being logically possible or contingent, and something being logically impossible. So the question arises: what is it that makes the difference between these things? Why is it the fact? What grounds the modal facts that a square circle is impossible because it's necessarily contradictory, whereas a horse is contingent? God hypothetically is necessary, or 1 + 1 = 2 is a necessary proposition, but a golden mountain is contingent. What is it that grounds the differences in these modal facts? And there are at least 5 different main theories as to what makes the difference there. And we're not going to get into that, but if you want to see the 5 different non-revisionist theories of what grounds modal facts. There are things like the what's it called? The strict logical, narrowly logical account of modality. There's the Lewisian count of modality. It's also known as the extreme modal realism view. There's the Platonist view, so someone like Alvin Plantinga takes that view. Then there's the Aristotelian essentialist view, which is the view that I personally take, or I think William Lane Craig takes this view as well. However, there are problems with these various views, I think. With the Aristotelian essentialist view, I think that's real, that's correct, that's the correct or best one we have. But that works, it assumes theism, and obviously an atheist or skeptic, someone that denies the PSR, is not likely to go for that. So what we're going to be assuming in this argument is the Aristotelian causal account of modality. And that just basically grounds modal facts in the fact that in causation, something that we are relatively familiar with in our lives, right? So something can cause another thing. It's within its causal powers to bring about that certain thing. That's what it means to cause, or to cause a chain of cause and effects to bring about that ultimate contingent thing, such as the universe, or that sort of thing. And I'll let you guys. I'll provide the source to Alexander Priest's website, where he goes over the 5 different accounts and what they mean, how modality works. That's section 2.2.63 on his website or in the Blackwell Companion. So yeah, that's our quick definitional thing. So how does this argument work? Let's get straight into that. And the first thing we need to understand is this argument works by assuming a self-evident axiom, and it's highly plausible, basically undeniable. So modal logic assumes what's called the Brouwer axiom. So that's Brouwer, spelled Brouwer. And the Brouwer axiom basically states that if a truth P holds, or thing holds, then it is a necessary truth that P is possible. Now, Alexander Proust, in making this argument, actually utilizes a weaker version. He's like, I don't even need you to give me the Brouwer axiom. I can just use a weaker version of the axiom, even though the Brouwer axiom is obviously true. It's self-evident to anyone with a functioning brain and who's interested in truth. But he just says, look, all I need you is the axiom if something holds contingently. So if something exists contingently in some possible worlds, but not in all possible worlds, then it is possible, obviously, for that thing to exist, for that thing to be both possible and false. This is just obviously true. It's undeniably true. Yeah, if something's logically possible, it's possible that it exists because it exists in some possible worlds, but not all of them. And since it doesn't exist in all of them, then it's possible for this thing to be false, because there are some possible worlds where this thing doesn't exist, or this proposition isn't true. Okay, so here's how the reductio ad absurdum argument works. Let us suppose, for the sake of reductio, that a contingent state of affairs, for example, the existence of the universe, the coming into existence of the universe, has no causal explanation. So this is the assumption of denying the PSR. We're saying the state of affairs whereby the universe came to exist has no causal explanation, as the PSR denying skeptic would like to maintain. So we can call that state of affairs E star, for example. And this would be, obviously, E star would be a contingent state of affairs, because there are logically possible worlds where the state of the universe coming into existence, quote unquote E, that we designate E, comes into existence with a cause. That's logically possible as well. Basically, by using the weaker version of the Brouwer axiom, it is possible that, quote unquote, E star, aka the universe coming into existence without an explanation, does not obtain, so it's false, but it's still possible. Remember our weakened version of the Brouwer principle, if something's logically contingent, then it's possible for that to be logically possible, but false. That's just an obvious self-evident truth. So let us suppose that a possible world is there, that where this E star state obtains. You know, the PSR is denied and the universe comes into existence without explanation. This would mean, because it's logically possible that there are possible worlds where the universe does come into existence with a cause, and there's a logically possible world where the universe comes into existence without a cause, hypothetically for the sake of argument, then that would mean that actually there is a cause, C, in this logically possible world where E star obtains, where the universe comes into existence without a cause. Actually, there's a cause in this world that initiates a chain of exercises of causal powers capable of leading to E star, or capable of leading to the universe coming into existence without an explanation or a cause. That's obviously logically contradictory. If you're scratching your head saying, what the heck is Dale saying? It's because it's logically absurd. It leads to a contradiction. Because in making this argument, in getting the skeptic, in supposing the skeptic's right in denying the PSR, and that it's possible that the universe comes into existence without a cause, then we thereby prove that actually there is a cause that both explains, that both gives a causal explanation for the existence of the universe, right? If one of the propositions or facts in that logically possible world, that maximal set of propositions, is different, that difference is a cause that changes the outcome and gives the event of the universe coming into existence a causal explanation. But, on the other hand, we're also saying that, well, if that fact is different in a different logically possible world, then that would cause or explain or lead to the fact that the universe comes into existence without an explanation, or that the PSR is false. The PSR does not exist. So it leads to a logical contradiction, and this is how the absurdity of the argument works. So yeah, hopefully I've explained that in a clear enough way. If I haven't, check out the sources. I'll give the specifics as to where you can find this argument and get an understanding of the different accounts of logical modality, and read it for yourself and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think this argument is great. Not only does it prove the truth of the PSR, it proves that it's logically necessary that that a PSR in general is true. Yeah, this is pretty powerful evidence against PSR denying skeptics. Okay, so let's switch gears, and I can picture the PSR denying skeptic pulling out their hair, saying, "Well, what, you've given all these positive pro-PSR arguments that prove that the PSR, or principle of sufficient reason, as you've defined, is true in general. But what about all the contra-PSR, the negative evidences against the general truth of the principle of sufficient reason? You've totally bypassed those." Well, guess what, Mr. PSR denying skeptic? We're going to get into that right now. So the first contra-PSR or PSR denying argument is really a weak and pathetic one, but it's called I call it the modal imagination argument. And this is basically where a PSR denying skeptic will just sort of, on an ad hoc basis, kind of smacks of desperation to my mind, but they'll just say, well, look, I can imagine a world without the PSR, therefore it's logically possible, right? You like to use properly basic beliefs, and you say that we have these modal evaluating faculties that produce properly basic beliefs to give us modal knowledge as to what's logically possible, or what's logically necessary, or what's impossible, blah, blah, blah. Fine, I as the PSR denying skeptic, I'm going to use that. I can imagine, say, a brick just popping into existence without an explanation or without a cause. Therefore, it's logically possible that this could obtain. Therefore, it's logically possible that the PSR is false. So how would we respond to this? So, number one, the first thing to say is, well, even if this is the case, that doesn't mean that the principle of sufficient reason is, in general, is false in the actual world, especially in light of all the positive evidences that I gave based on the actual world that we live in that proves that there is a principle of sufficient reason. Even if it is logically possible, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the case that in the actual world the PSR is false. So you can respond in that way. Secondly, don't forget the pro-PSR argument we just covered. We proved even if it is logically possible, then it leads to logically contradictory results and proves that the PSR is actually necessary. It is true in all logically possible worlds, and it is therefore logically impossible for the PSR denying skeptic to be telling the truth. They're either lying or they're deluded. When they say they can imagine a brick just coming into being uncaused or unexplained, totally inexplicably, just popping in and out of existence or something like that, I'm right, they're wrong. Now, what may account for this? It might not be the case that these PSR denying skeptics are actually lying, or just trying to come up with some desperate way to avoid the obvious truth. They could be woefully deluding themselves, and how would we explain that then? So how could they be deluded about such a self-evident truth? And I think what happens a lot of times is skeptics and people that use imagination will sometimes confuse imaginability with conceivability. Conceivability is what's important for us to say that something is logically possible or not necessarily imaginability, because sometimes people might say they can imagine things that aren't actually conceivable, like temporal paradoxes, for example, or sometimes we can conceive of something that we can't imagine. That happens to me all the time. There are various complex quantum phenomena, for example. We can conceive of it and explain it mathematically, but as Richard Feynman says, it's impossible for our minds to imagine or a scenario where that explains it based on our experience of the macro world and that sort of thing. You can conceive of the phenomena taking place through mathematical explanation, which interestingly, my Professor Paul was saying that this sort of disproves the Democritus type view of reality of atoms and all of that, and so it shows that Plato is right. Actually, ultimate reality is Platonic. It's explained by these mathematical concepts more at a fundamental level rather than concrete physical objects. That's just an aside, but that's my point. So I would just deny, no, actually, you're not imagining it. It's logically impossible for you to imagine it, and we've objectively proven that via reductio ad absurdum argument above, the nature of modality argument that we gave just prior to this one. And in terms of your imaginability, I don't believe you. I think that you're not clear in your terms. You're not being clear to distinguish imaginability from conceivability. Sure, I can imagine a brick coming into being without a brick maker or without clay needing to be dried in the sun or something, and it just, from our point of view, quote unquote, pops into existence. But that doesn't mean I'm imagining it coming into existence without a cause or without an explanation. No, it still has it. Maybe I'm imagining an invisible supernatural being popping that brick through his causal powers into existence. That's what we're imagining, and you're mistaking that cause for no cause at all. So you just haven't thought too clearly about this as a PSR denying skeptic, and you haven't taken the efforts to distinguish between imaginability and conceivability. And this is what I find is most of the time occurring with skeptics who say they can just imagine this as sort of like a counter example or something like that. They don't know what they're talking about. They haven't really given it serious thought. It's more just an emotional reaction of wanting to deny the obvious truth. That may sound harsh and too dismissive, but I actually think that I have the right to do so in this case. Not only because I have the right to based on experience, my experience with skeptics who don't know too much about modality, or they try to quickly get rid of the principle of sufficient reason by saying, oh, well, this is imaginable. I can imagine this. I can imagine that. But also, it's logically proven via our last argument. We know for a fact, logically, that these people are either lying or are deluded when they say they can imagine something coming into existence inexplicably. Complete rubbish. So this argument is an utter failure. We're going to move on to something a little bit more substantive. This is what's called the modal fatalism argument. And believe it or not, this was developed by a PSR denying skeptic who's a Christian. What? For once, not an atheist. Dr. Peter van Inwagen developed this modal fatalism argument. And there are really two versions of the modal fatalism argument. So there's the official original one developed by Peter van Inwagen, and then there's a second probabilistic version of the van Inwagen argument here. And remember, this is the reason William Lane Craig rejected the Leibnizian cosmological argument. Depending on how you define the principle of sufficient reason, if you define it in the way Leibniz did, every fact, every true proposition, including necessary and contingent, has an explanation for its existence. Not to mention also the fact that it's the truth value or false value of those necessary propositions themselves. This leads to modal fatalism. Everything that happened logically necessarily. That's what this argument tries to imply. And there's a long list of premises here. I'm not going to go over everything, but I'm going to include in the blog, I'm going to include the actual deductive argument, because it's a logically valid argument that he provides, and it's a reductio ad absurdum type argument against the truth of the principle of sufficient reason. However, here, the very first premise is what I'm going to highlight here. And this premise says no necessary proposition or thing explains a contingent proposition or thing. This is really the key downfall of the argument. This argument that he provides, predicated upon this first premise, it's logically valid, doesn't commit any fallacies or that sort of thing, but this premise is false. I'm sorry, it's wrong. And it's amazing how many brilliant people fall for this kind of thing. They think this is a true premise. It's not just Peter van Inwagen. I read The Existence of God by Richard Swinburne. He believes this premise is true as well. In fact, it's the reason why he doesn't believe God is a metaphysically or logically necessary being. He thinks it's impossible for that to be the case. He thinks God is merely factually necessary, in the same way the laws of nature are factually necessary. So ultimately, Richard Swinburne believes quite uniquely and controversially in a contingent God, or at the very least a necessary dependent God of some sort, dependent on something else. So that's kind of a weird view, but this premise is accepted by people that are brilliant, and even Christian philosophers. Peter van Inwagen developed this, and Richard Swinburne, and there are some others as well. So, yeah, what's the problem here? Why should we reject this premise as being false? And basically it comes down to the fact that they believe that, look, how do we define the principle? What does it mean to have a quote-unquote sufficient reason or sufficient explanation? And really that will be the definition. Our principle of sufficient reason entails that everything has an explanation. But there's a qualifier that I add in my argument that I haven't mentioned up until this point. I haven't mentioned it because I wanted to make it at this point. It's not just an explanation, though. It's a quote-unquote sufficient explanation, because there are different types of explanations that Richard Swinburne, in his book, for example, he makes a contrast between scientific and personal explanations. Furthermore, he makes differences that's relevant to this point. There are complete explanations, there are ultimate explanations, which he believes God qualifies for, and then there are absolute explanations, which he denies, because absolute explanations there's a metaphysically necessary explanation, and that explains all other contingent things. But what is the problem with that? And it's because they believe that in order for something to be a quote unquote sufficient explanation or sufficient reason, it has to logically entail the consequent, or logically entail the explanandum, the thing being explained. And that's the root of this premise, and that is just blatantly false. It's not true. And it's understandable why they get this wrong, because Leibniz himself defined the sufficient reason or sufficient explanation to mean the same as logical entailment. Big mistake. That makes everything metaphysically necessary. Modal fatalism would be true. But actually, I'm just looking for a sufficient explanation, not an absolute explanation, not an entailing explanation, just something that explains the explanandum and is sufficient for that purpose. So let's give a couple of examples of how we can prove that actually we know for a fact that there are many sufficient explanations that don't logically entail the consequent explanandum, or the effect. So here are a couple of examples. So the first example is obvious. There are statistical explanations. Things like saying, well, smoking explains or is sufficient. Someone smoking for 30 years is sufficient to explain a person getting lung cancer. This is a statistical explanation. It by definition does not logically entail. If you could smoke for 30 years, but that doesn't entail that you will get lung cancer. It's possible you could get off the hook and not suffer a day in your life because of it in some way, or something like that. So statistical explanations are sufficient even though they don't logically entail the explanandum. No scientist or mathematician in the world would deny that statistical explanations are insufficient, count as insufficient reasons or insufficient explanations, simply because they don't logically entail the given phenomenon or the state of affairs in question. Likewise, we also have in science non-statistical explanations. So for example, what explains the planet's elliptical orbits? Well, we would provide it's sufficient to explain that through the sun's mass and its gravitational influence. That's a sufficient scientific explanation, and but that doesn't logically entail that the planets will have the elliptical orbits, right? It's on the assumption that there isn't anything else that can overwhelm the sun's mass or the sun's gravitational influence. And without a principle of sufficient reason, remember, things could be popping in and out of existence all the time. A more massive object could just pop into existence in our solar system and thereby screw up the planet's elliptical orbits. Without a PSR, you have no way of denying that. So again, the point is, it's a sufficient explanation to say what causes the planet's elliptical orbits. Oh, the sun's mass. That's a scientifically sufficient explanation. No one would deny that. But again, it doesn't the sun taking the fact or the cause of the sun's mass does not logically entail that the planet's orbits will be elliptical. And Alexander Proust goes into great detail and depth in showing why the explanation for the planetary's elliptical orbits can never be considered something that logically entails its effects. So these are just a couple of examples that prove that actually a sufficient explanation does not mean that the effect has to be logically entailed by the cause or by the explanation in order for the principle of sufficient reason as we're defining it to be true. So yeah, that's really the Achilles heel of Peter van Inwagen's argument. He makes this false assumption that even Leibniz himself did, where he thinks that in order for something to be a quote-unquote sufficient reason or sufficient explanation, it must logically entail the explanandum, and that's just absolutely false. Now, some skeptics might try to object and say that, well, we prefer explanations that logically entail the consequent. Those are better kinds of explanations. So, your definition of a sufficient explanation, we expect better, we want better, we desire a better type of explanation that logically entails the consequent. And to that I would just say, well, that's your fault and your problem. Sure, there are different types of explanations, and some may be better than others. But for the sake of making a successful cosmological argument, it doesn't matter. Obviously, there are incomplete explanations or different types of explanations that don't involve logical entailment, but they are obviously sufficient, as I proved. And all I need for my Leibnizian cosmological argument to be successful is that there is a sufficient reason or a sufficient explanation. Outside of that, if we can get an explanation that logically entails the explanandum, well, so much the better. But if we can't, it doesn't matter. The argument is still successful. So that's Peter van Inwagen's original version of the argument and its Achilles heel. But there's actually a probabilistic version of the modal fatalism argument. And so instead of premise 11, instead of the first premise that I was responding to there that was controversial, they'll change it up and say, okay, well, the first premise is here: if something explains a contingent thing, then probably that explanation, given the existence of the effect, or the thing being explained, is greater than a half. So that's the new first premise, and then all the remaining premises are exactly the same in the argument. It's logically deductive, it's valid, and it works, and that sort of thing. So here's the problem. It leads to a reductio ad absurdum, because in this case, by following this premise, eventually you will get overall probabilities of greater than 100%, and that is logically absurd. It's logically impossible for you to get a probability of 110%. You just sound like a fool when you say something like that. You don't know what you're talking about, or you're saying it to score a rhetorical point or something. But yeah, so again, the Achilles heel with this version of the argument is the first premise is false. It's clearly false. And I can deny the truth of this premise on a balance of probabilities, therefore the argument fails. So why is this the case? Why would this premise be false? Why would I say that? Well, because in the first place, statistical relevance theories deny the truth of this premise. If you're a mathematician, Anthony 66, back me up. Statistical relevance theories say that this premise is false. Because it shows a mistaken conflation of explanation with mere prediction. There's a famous case, it's called the syphilis paresis counterexample to this, that directly counteracts this example with scientific evidence, medical evidence as a counterexample. So this is a famous counterexample that basically says, look, one's paresis can be, quote unquote, sufficiently explained through the latent untreated syphilis, through a patient's latent untreated syphilis. So they had syphilis, it wasn't treated, and it was allowed to progress, so that explains, or sufficiently explains, why you now have paresis. But the problem is, this is true. This is a sufficient explanation, even if the probability is low that this is the actual explanation in effect, because actually untreated syphilis leads to paresis only in a minority of cases. It's less than a half. So yeah, it's perfectly plausible that an actual cause of something can be filtered through events with probabilities of less than 50%, falsifying the premise. It doesn't have to be something that's more probable than not. Things that are improbable occur all the time. Another counterexample are forensic explanations. These prove that this premise is false. So what explains David Johnson's drowning? Hopefully I get your attention here, David, but what explains David Johnson's drowning? Well, that can be, quote unquote, sufficiently explained by Dale Glover getting angry and pushing him over a cliff into the water, whereby he was unable to swim to safety and he drowned. This sufficiently explains the explanandum of David's drowning, the thing that we're trying to explain. It's sufficient. But it's also sufficient even if it were the case that David Johnson, unbeknownst to me, the murderer, is actually a professional cliff diver, and it's improbable that he would drown as a result of falling off a cliff into the water. Let's say there was only a 25% chance of David Johnson's dying as a result of being pushed into the water off the cliff. The fact is, though, even though there's a low probability, David still fell in the water and actually died. In actuality, my pushing him over the cliff, whether it's a complete explanation or not, it is a sufficient explanation to explain why David Johnson drowned. Obviously, a complete explanation would also take into account certain scientific facts. Why is it that mammals expire or die when they have a lack of oxygen and all of that stuff? That doesn't matter. There's the personal explanation that Richard Swinburne would say. There's the scientific explanation, and or there's also the personal explanation, and the personal explanation in this case is sufficient. David drowned because Dale pushed him over a cliff and he couldn't swim to safety. He didn't swim to safety in time. So yeah, this falsifies this. And obviously, if we're talking probabilities less than 50%, we avoid the reductio ad absurdum of getting a combined overall probabilities over 100% and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's no reduction to absurdity here, and the PSR maintains its truth. Okay, so let's move on to what I think is the most substantive skeptical or counter-PSR argument, or at least at face value, it's the most substantive contra-PSR argument or argument against the truth of the principle of sufficient reason being applicable to existing things in general. And that is the quantum argument from quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Basically, PSR denying skeptics will appeal to the alleged indeterministic nature of quantum effects. Things like subatomic particles merely pop into and out of existence all the time. And it's said they do so without explanation. Inexplicably, just they pop up. And it's claimed, according to them, quantum physics and modern science has proven that the principle of sufficient reason is false. This argument, and note that this argument can also be sort of used as a double whammy. Let's pretend I can refute this argument, which, as we'll see, easily can be done. Okay, the skeptic may say, okay, well, great. Well, using quantum mechanics, maybe you've falsified my nonsensical claim that quantum mechanics proves there isn't a principle of sufficient reason in general. Okay, I now admit that there is a PSR in general, but I modify the quantum physics and say, but not at the quantum level, because maybe things in general at the macroscopic level, the PSR applies to them. But at in the quantum world, that represents a justified exemption or exception. Remember, aspect 2 of our argument is we have to apply the PSR in general to the universe in particular, the existence of the universe in particular. And the PSR denying skeptic will say, but at the quantum world, the PSR is true for macro level events, but in the quantum world, it's not true there. And therefore, it's not applicable to the universe in particular, because at one point in time, I think it's around the Planck time or something, 10 to the minus 43 seconds, something like that, the universe was so small, it was at the subatomic level. It was at the quantum physics would apply to the universe itself, and therefore the universe could have popped into existence uncaused or inexplicably. So this argument is really a double whammy. It can be used to try to deny the general applicability of or existence of a PSR, the truth of the PSR in general, and or if it fails there, which it will, can be modified to say, well, in the particular case of the universe, it represents an exemption or an exception that's justified to the general applicability of the PSR itself, and thereby the universe, being a part of the quantum world at one time, is exempt from this principle of sufficient reason. So, yeah, how do we respond to this type of argument? Well, in the first place, it's easy. In regards to the aspect number 1, we can just say, well, pointing to quantum mechanics, even if you're right about this, it doesn't matter, because quantum mechanics is just an exception or an exemption to the rule. It's a justified exemption. That doesn't disprove that the PSR isn't true in general, given the fact that we've proven through the positive evidence above the existence of probability, macroscopic science, methodological naturalism, ethics and moral. We've proven over and over again that the principle of sufficient reason in general applies, at least beyond the quantum realm. So if you are correct about the quantum realm, who cares? That's just an exemption or an exception that doesn't prove the PSR doesn't exist in general. Of course, at that point, the PSR denying skeptic will simply smile and say, okay, well then you've shot yourself, because now you can't establish aspect 2 because the universe was at the quantum realm. So here, how do we respond to both at once? So establishing this argument is complete and utter rubbish, because actually quantum physics do have explanations. The principle of sufficient reason applies at the level of quantum mechanics or quantum physics. They do have explanations. They're statistical in nature. Remember, we proved before that statistical explanations are sufficient explanations. So even if you accept quantum indeterminacy, which I don't, I personally hold to a quantum deterministic model. And remember, with these counter-PSR arguments, it's the PSR denying skeptic that bears the burden of proof. He is making a claim that the principle of sufficient reason is false, either in general or in aspect number 2 in the case of applying to the universe, and that quantum indeterminacy proves that it's false. Actually, you're wrong, skeptic, because number 1, you can't prove that quantum indeterminacy is true. There are deterministic quantum models or interpretations of quantum physics that are empirically equivalent. Science cannot adjudicate between them. And I'll provide a source. William Lane Craig mentions this, and Dr. Sean Carroll, the atheist world's expert and scientist, physicist and cosmologist, confirms, yep, there are these empirically equivalent things, including David Bohm's deterministic model of quantum physics. So you can simply go to the skeptic, oh yeah, you think quantum indeterminacy proves that the PSR isn't true? Well, prove that quantum indeterminacy is true, and he'll just go, I can't do it. If he knows what he's talking about, of course. But even if quantum indeterminacy is true, one of the indeterministic models is true, so what? There's still a sufficient explanation. Maybe it's not a logically entailing explanation, like a deterministic model might be able to give, but it's a sufficient explanation through mathematical probabilities and statistical outcomes and that sort of thing. So once again, utter failure. The principle of sufficient reason does in fact apply to the realm of quantum mechanics and quantum physics. Yeah, it's a nice attempt, but I think that this argument utterly fails, just like all the rest of the negative arguments that we've seen thus far. So here's our final counter PSR argument, and this is an argument that I think you saw. I just saw glimpses of it, but Val and the guest Andrew Loke from the Unbelievable show on the Kalam cosmological argument was sort of getting into a discussion with Val about the nature of libertarian free will and how that relates to things having a cause and that sort of thing. And they're sort of back and forth on that. Val kind of reminds me of these PSR denying skeptics who try to advance what I call the contrastive explanation argument. So the PSR denying skeptic will say, well, the principle of sufficient reason can't be true because it doesn't provide contrastive explanations. So an example would be, why does an electron, in quantum physics, why does an electron go up rather than down? The rather than is the contrastive part. So in order for an explanation to be sufficient, they say, here's another example with the libertarian free will. Why does Dale freely choose to eat an apple rather than an orange in a given case? What's the explanation for that? And they say, in order to have a sufficient explanation, it has to be a contrastive explanation, a specific type of explanation. So it's not enough to explain why I ate an apple or why an electron went up, but you have to explain why it went up rather than down. Why didn't it go down? Or why didn't Dale eat an orange? They try to say you have to provide these ternary explanations as opposed to just the binary explanation. And in the first place, I just say this isn't true. Remember, it's on the skeptic, the PSR denier, to prove his case here. And in the case of, if someone adopts an anti-realist perspective, so that, propositions aren't quote-unquote things, our weak or modest version of the principle of sufficient reason doesn't matter about contrastive propositions. They don't require explanations. Numbers, propositions, they don't need explanations. They aren't things, right? That they aren't quote-unquote existing things that the PSR would apply to. So I can escape this argument that way. Or if you are a realist, because I am a realist, a divine conceptualist, it's not at all clear. It's not true that a sufficient explanation has to include a contrastive explanation. No. In the same way we don't have to provide logically entailing explanations, we don't have to provide contrastive explanations. We provide sufficient explanations for things that are non-contrastive all the time. Think of it this way. So what explains my choosing to eat an apple rather than an orange? Well, the same explanation would apply as to why I actually chose to eat an apple. That would apply to why I would have chosen to eat an orange. So we can say, oh, well, there are Dale's free will through agent causation. That's the explanation. I'm a prime mover in a new set of causal chains. That's what libertarian free will posits, and it's perfectly acceptable to give a personal explanation that assumes libertarian free will and agent causation. That is rational, and the skeptic cannot prove that it's not rational. And again, he bears the burden of proof for this argument to go through, and therefore prove the PSR's false. But yeah, I can be, while being impressed by certain reasons. So I could choose to eat the apple by being impressed by reasons. I like the color red. And by the same token, I could have chosen to eat an orange because I'm in a citrus mood, the mood for citrus today. So in the case of me eating an apple rather than an orange, the same explanatory priors are present whether I choose to eat an apple or an orange. And they'll say, well, therefore you don't get this explanation of why actually the apple rather than the orange. If it's the same explanatory causes, what is it that differentiates and allows you to actually go for the apple versus the orange? And it's the personal explanation aspect. And through agent causation, I am a free agent, and while I'm impressed by the same explanatory priors or reasons for my decision, I'm a prime mover in a new causal chain, and that is perfectly sensible to give a binary rather than a ternary relationship as an explanation. So yeah, there's absolutely no problem here. Skeptics are out to lunch when they demand that a contrastive explanation is necessary. No, we give binary sufficient explanations all the time, and that's all that my premise is arguing for, a sufficient explanation. That doesn't mean it has to be a contrastive explanation. Even if the same explanatory factors are involved in explaining why I chose to eat an apple versus an orange, it doesn't matter, because there's that additional thing of the agent causation as a prime mover. I chose the apple. That's what I wanted to eat, and that's how we explain things all the time via what Richard Swinburne calls personal explanation. So this is an utter failure as an argument. So yeah, I think basically we've seen that all of the skeptical counter-PSR arguments are total failures. The PSR denying skeptic cannot prove on a balance of probabilities that any single one of them disqualifies the general existence or truth of the principle of sufficient reason as we have defined it. Secondly, on the positive evidence side, for the truth of the principle of sufficient reason in general, we have seen through the properly basic belief in self-evidence that it's 100% certain. In my estimation, you might have different numbers, but we've seen that the PSR, we can know the PSR exists in that way. There's also the God remnant argument that may apply to some of you skeptics, the probability argument, which is successful, but I didn't include because I didn't totally understand it. There's no widespread violations of the PSR that we observe in the world around us. Bada boom, bada bing, destroying PSR denying skeptics and proving that it's true in general. And then finally, we gave our the last positive evidence, the nature of modality argument, which again, very strong. It shows there's a logical contradiction in claiming the PSR is false, in claiming that it's even possible for the PSR to be false. Therefore, the PSR is a necessary truth. Wow. Plugging those various factors into Bayes' theorem, so again, no negative evidence has had over 50% proven level based on my figures, so they're excluded from the calculation. If some of you assigned one or more of those negative evidences a value of 50.01% or higher, then you will want to plug those into Bayes' theorem as well to get the cumulative case probability overall. But yeah, for me, there's just those three factors: the nature, modality, the properly based belief / sufficient evidence, and the no widespread violations of the PSR argument that went into my factor. And obviously, since the properly basic belief or self-evidence factor proved for me that I'm 100% warranted, it's absolutely certain that the principle of sufficient reason, as I have defined it in premise 2, is in fact true. It doesn't matter what the other factors are, I'm at 100%. It's always going to be 100%. Even if on the negative side I had 99.99%, the calculation would still come out 100%. That aspect 1 of premise 2, the general truth of the PSR is true. But we're not done now. So great, I've established that aspect 1 is true, that the principle of sufficient reason generally is true and applies to quote-unquote existing things. But what about aspect 2? Does this general PSR apply in the case of the universe in particular? And on this front, so in the first place, the main evidence I gave is the fact that there's a properly basic belief or self-evidence. And in that respect, I assigned a 99% degree of warrant to saying that, yes, the PSR is not only generally true, I'm absolutely certain of that, but it also applies in the case of the particular case of the existing universe. On the negative side, the only one that was possibly relevant to aspect 2 was the quantum physics argument against it. But as we saw there, again, this is actually false because quantum physics do have sufficient explanations. They're just statistical explanations. They're not logically entailing explanations. That doesn't matter. They still have sufficient explanations that are sufficient to explain the explanandum, or give a reason for their existence, the thing that exists. So yeah, basically we're 99% proven that the PSR does in fact apply to the case of the universe. And this is the default position, given that it's generally true and that the universe is an existing thing. The burden of proof shifts from me to the skeptic to prove that there is a justification for exempting or accepting this general PSR principle. If they don't, they're committing the taxicab fallacy, because taxicab fallacy is basically where you use the PSR for as long as you want until you arrive at your desired location. Then, whoops, we get to the universe. That implies God. Oh, yikes, I'm an atheist and skeptic, and I'm so biased I don't want to admit that there's a God, so I'm going to jump out and abandon the PSR at the level of the universe, so that way I don't have to worry about explaining that. Sorry, skeptics, that's a logical fallacy called the taxicab logical fallacy. And remember, skeptics and atheists apply this to Christians. We're going to be covering the taxicab fallacy when it comes to, okay, if you can prove there's a first cause or ultimate explanation, what caused or explained that? What caused God? So skeptics, obviously, atheists recognize that the taxicab fallacy is something you can't do. You can't just arbitrarily get off and stop using the PSR when it becomes inconvenient for you. And based on this fact and the fact that the PSR is always true inductively and that sort of thing, it's never been observed to be false. So even if you want to arrive at that inductively through some sort of inductive argument, the burden of proof is clearly on the PSR denying skeptic to prove that the universe is a justified exemption or exception. So yeah, what can the a skeptic do to prove that actually, no, it doesn't apply in the case of the universe? We're justified in saying that is an exception or an exemption. And we gave the quantum mechanics argument that fails because they do actually quantum phenomena does qualify from the PSR. Oh, and sorry, just before I get into the reasons for a claim to justification, with the taxicab fallacy and the assumption of innocence until proven guilty once the general principle has been established and that sort of thing, outside of a properly based belief, Richard Taylor, and I'm going to provide a source, his article where he argues this for you guys in the sources, but he basically uses the example of a translucent ball. Let's say you come across that during a hike in the woods, and you say, well, what explains why this ball is sitting here? And then, well, you say, I don't know, but it obviously has an explanation. Well, simply increasing the size of the ball doesn't, if it's to the size of a house, well, still requires an explanation. It didn't just pop into existence inexplicably. That's absurd. You're a fool if you think that's true. Well, what if we increase that translucent ball to the size of a planet? Same thing. You're a fool if you say it just exists inexplicably. What if we increase the size to be the same size as the universe? You're an ignorant fool if you say that this has no explanation of its existence. So skeptics might try to say, well, it's something to do with the size of the universe. No, it's the principle of sufficient reason applies to existing things, irrespective of its size. So you can't escape it just because, oh, the universe is so big for me to think of or conceive of, so maybe somehow that doesn't have an explanation. No, that's not the way logic works. That's again committing the taxicab fallacy and pointing to an irrelevant factor, namely the size of the quote-unquote existing thing, to try and avoid the application of the PSR. You're not allowed to do that. Another thing that atheists or skeptics have tried to do here to try and establish that, well, in the case of the universe, there is a justified exemption or exception to the principle of sufficient reason to it, comes from a couple of skeptics, Crispin Wright and Bob Hale. Now, make mention here, they fully admit there is a general principle of sufficient reason, and that is the proven default, the epistemic default. You have to therefore come up with a rationally justified exemption or exception to that general principle in the case of the universe, and they think they have. Because their reason is, well, look, they just assert and assume, as per typical skeptical strategy I find a lot of times, at least with lay skeptics and that, but they'll just assert and assume, well, any physical state of affairs or any physical thing, like the universe, requires a causally prior physical state of affairs or thing to cause it. And that physical thing, that prior physical thing, has to exist before the physical explanandum, i.e. the universe, existed. Okay, well, where does the skeptic go wrong here? Basically, they're assuming that, well, look, since the universe represents all of physical reality, it's all of space-time and its physical contents, that means there was actually a state of nothingness prior to the existence of the universe, or causally prior to the physical universe coming into existence. And since nothing can't stand in causally or explanatorily prior relations with anything, therefore the universe is an exception to the principle of sufficient reason. It doesn't have an explanation because it can't. So where's the flaw here? And basically it's quite obvious. These atheists are assuming and begging the question in favor of atheism. They're just assuming that the only things that can cause physical things are physical things. And since there weren't any physical things causally prior to the Big Bang or to the existence of the universe, I guess it doesn't have an explanation. But that's assuming physicalism or materialism. You're not allowed to do that. You can't just deny the equal possibility or probability of there being a non-physical state of affairs or thing, namely God, perhaps, that caused the universe to come into existence. You're not allowed to just deny that and beg the question in favor of atheism. The reason for this is because we have what's called a principle of indifference, and this is something that I've gone back and forth with Val on in the context of supernatural miracles or those kinds of explanations where skeptics will just sort of assume only certain kinds of explanations are true. If you remember, I said the default prior probability in a Bayesian sense is 50% for any hypothesis. If you hear hoof prints coming down the thing, it could be a horse, could be a zebra, or it could be a unicorn. Val would say, no, you have to rule out the unicorn. And I was saying, well, no, not a priori right away, because we have a principle of indifference. And that basically states that, look, you have to treat every single, it's basically a rule for assigning epistemic probabilities. It states that in the absence of any relevant evidence, so background evidence in this case, agents should distribute their credence or degrees of belief equally amongst all the possible outcomes under consideration. And in a Bayesian sense, that equals the 50% mark. Or in other, in Andrew's sense, you could say, well, it's 0% proven for all of the various options. But where Val will come in is if you have a reason to suppose through background evidence or through direct a posteriori evidence to rule out certain options, well then, yeah, you have a justification for ruling out certain options compared to others. But this is what I was getting at, this principle of indifference. And a non-physical cause, given the principle of indifference and no proven reasons to rule out non-physical causes causing physical causes, or explaining physical causes, you don't have the right to just assert and assume that they can't explain it. I'm sorry, you have to prove that as the skeptic here, and you can't. So that's why this argument fails. However, there is a second aspect here that's not covered by Bob Hale and Crispin Wright, and that comes down to okay, well, sure, I'll give you that it's equally probable that a non-physical cause could explain a physical effect like the existence of the universe, but remember, it's got to be causally prior in that case. And remember what the universe is. It is the origin of space and time and all its contents, as I've defined it. So causes, the principle of sufficient reason is predicated upon time. Something has to be temporally or chronologically prior to the existence of the effect in order to be said to explain or cause it. So there's this skeptical objection that the cause and effect relationship is predicated upon there being not just an explanatory or causal priority is identical to a temporal or chronological priority, right? Obviously, if you cause something to exist, or truly to begin to exist, as we'll argue in the case of the universe, then that requires something to exist before that to cause it within time. Now, how would we respond to this objection here? So that creates a justified exception or exemption to the universe, right? If there's no time, then there's no cause for that, because nothing was chronologically prior to the start of the universe. It's like Stephen Hawking in his book, The Grand Design, says it's like asking what is south of the South Pole. It's just logically absurd, doesn't make sense. So great, that's a justified exemption to the principle of sufficient reason, right? In the case of the universe. Well, no, skeptics, no, sorry. So in the first place, with the Leibnizian cosmological argument, I'm allowed to just say, well, actually, guess what? No, there was a chronological prior point in time. Time and space and time are eternal. This argument doesn't assume that the universe began to exist like the Kalam cosmological argument does. Time is eternal. Or I could say that there was, or even if you accept the Big Bang, I could say like Hugh Ross. I could say, oh, well, there's a second dimension of time. There's hypertime. Or as Hugh Ross goes on further, there's hyper time. That's the dimension of time God exists in. So there is an eternal temporal procession or chronological procession of events, of cause and effects over the course of eternity. Therefore, totally bypassing this skeptical objection to the case of the universe. However, I actually don't buy that. I actually do think that time began to exist, as we'll find out in the Kalam cosmological argument in our next episode in this series. So, okay, this objection would then obtain, right? Wrong. The reason is because, no, it's just illogical and false, scientifically proven to be false, actually, that something needs to be temporally or chronologically prior to an effect in order to be said to be causally or explanatorily prior to an effect. That's wrong. And one of the best examples that people have is let's picture a big ball sitting on a cushion, and the cushion gets dense, and it gets why can't I think of the word? It gets depressions in it because of the weight of the ball, the mass of the ball sitting on it. Further, we could suppose that the ball was sitting on that cushion, thereby causing, explanatorily or causally prior to the depression in the pillow. Right? The depression in the pillow doesn't cause the ball, to the mass of the ball there. So we can imagine that that ball was sitting on the cushion for eternity. Therefore, there was no chronological priority of the ball falling onto the cushion causing the depression to occur. They just existed for all of eternity, eternity past, like that. It's called simultaneous causation, and science has proven it. Albert Einstein has gotten into this, and yeah, this is a valid concept. Simultaneous causation can allow there to be an explanatorily prior cause for a given effect, like the existence of the universe, but does not necessitate a chronological or temporal priority of the cause in relation to the effect. Obviously that's controversial. Someone like Skydive Phil, for example, and when he wrote the Still Unbelievable chapter, I remember the comments, he questioned that simultaneous causation is true. I don't. I've looked into it, and it's scientifically proven to be true, and is obvious the case, as in the case of the example that I gave. It is an equal possibility, and skeptics have failed to meet their burden of proof to prove that it's probably true that something like simultaneous causation is false, and that's what they need to do to overcome aspect 2 and say that the universe is a justified exemption or exception. And I'll actually provide a couple of interesting articles, scholarly level articles in the sources between William Lane Craig and Dr. Gronbaum. Basically, William Lane Craig argues for this simultaneous causation, that causal priority is not the same as chronological priority. They're not identical in order for something to be caused. And then Gronbaum, I'll give his article responding to that, saying, well, that's nonsense. And then William Lane Craig follows up with that, completely destroying the atheist philosopher there with his final response. So you get to see sort of an interesting back and forth between two experts, philosophers, going back and forth on this specific issue there. Okay, so the final attempt of the skeptic here could be an objection that B.D. Rundle gives. And he says, well, look, I admit that that the universe is contingent, and I admit that it must go back to some. It can't just exist totally inexplicably. There must be some reason for it, and it exists. And here's his thing. He'll say that necessarily something exists out of logical necessity, but what that something is totally inexplicable. So he denies the PSR. We can ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is because, well, necessarily something has to exist, but as to what that something is, it doesn't matter. It could be anything. It could be a ball, could be a universe, could be Dale Glover or a Boltzmann brain. As long as necessarily something has to exist. But what that something is, there's no answer. That's just inexplicable. The principle of sufficient reason doesn't explain why we have the particular something, i.e. the universe, that we have as opposed to, rather than another something. So it's kind of akin to, look, every object necessarily has a shape, but nevertheless, it's totally contingent or inexplicable. No particular shape, there's no particular shape that the object necessarily has. So there's nothing, there are no things that exist that necessarily exist, but necessarily there is something that exists, if that makes sense. So that's the objection by B.D. Rundle and others who've given this. I think Matt Dillahunty raises this in one of the sources. I'll give his short 35-minute video about his thoughts on the contingency argument here, including the version that we're using. So the rebuttal basically to this is twofold. So this is just total logical absurdity and nonsense on the part of atheists. Number one, Alexander Proust has logically proven that it's not true. It's absurd to say that the conjunction of claims about the non-existence of various things logically entails that something exists. So if you think of the maximally possible, logically possible worlds, that maximal set of propositions, if we have a bunch of a horse doesn't exist, mountains don't exist, and lakes don't exist, and David Johnson doesn't exist, and stars don't exist, and we give a maximal conjunction of all the things that don't exist, that doesn't logically entail that all of a sudden a unicorn does exist, or necessarily must exist, or that a dragon exists contingently. Not necessarily exists, that a unicorn contingently exists, or that a dragon contingently exists in that logically possible world. This is just absurd to think. So this argument is an utter failure, and it fails based on that alone. But secondly, we have another devastating critique to this nonsense, atheistic nonsense, because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, without a metaphysically or logically necessary being to cause the contingent beings to exist in their respective possible worlds, there just is no sufficient reason or explanation as to why it's necessary that one contingent being or another inhabit or obtains in any possible worlds at all. You know, certainly there's no logical contradiction, explicit or implicit, about a world just completely devoid of contingent beings. Certainly Christians conceive of that as the God alone. My skeptical co-host David Johnson, he said, well, it's possible God couldn't have created anything. There's no contingent beings. That's logically possible. Just God necessarily existing on his own. So certainly we can conceive of possible worlds where there are no contingent things. There's no logical contradiction, either explicit or implicit, in that possibility. So it's just ad hoc on the part of these atheists and skeptics, being so desperate, given the vast infinity of broadly logical possible worlds, to just say, well, contingent beings necessarily exist. One contingent being or another necessarily exists in each of the logically possible worlds inexplicably, without any explanation as to why. This is just ad hoc and immensely improbable. It strains the bounds of credulity for reasonable people. That's it. So based on that, as I said, based on the properly based belief in self-evidence, the lack of skeptical justifications for exempting or accepting the principle of sufficient reason to the existing universe as an existing thing, and the fact that we can't commit the logical taxicab fallacy and just abandon the PSR whenever it's convenient to us. Well, we know that the universe is an existing thing. We proved that in premise 1. The PSR generally applies to all existing things and cannot be abandoned without justification. The skeptic and atheist has totally failed to provide justification in the particular case of the universe, the justification for an exemption or an exception in the particular case of the universe. Therefore, premise number 2 is 100% generally true times 99% proven true in the case of the universe itself, the universe's existence. Therefore, premise number 2 has been 99% warranted as being true in terms of my normative probability values. Again, you'll have your own probability values, but it should be in the same ballpark. If you don't have something in the ballpark between 95 and 100%, you're unreasonable. There's something wrong with you. You are outside the reasonableness range in terms of all these persuasive arguments. The PSR is that strong that it is undeniably true. And if you do deny it's true, then you are an unreasonable person. You are outside of what I call the reasonableness range. But I think that there can be a range. Maybe you're 96%, I'm 99%. Maybe somebody else is 100%, maybe someone else is 97. I would define the reasonableness range as being 95.01% beyond reasonable doubt to 100%. So yeah, if you're outside of that, then maybe take a serious look at yourself and see if you're being open-minded or closed-minded or something, or you're not understanding the nature of reality or the arguments that I presented here. Because this is truly strong. It is truly, the truth of this premise is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Just before we get into premise 3, just wanted to give a quick addendum here about premise 2. So with aspect number 2, so applying the principle of sufficient reason in particular to the case of the universe, there is no justified exemption or exception. I said it was not, I'm 99% warranted of this premise based on a properly based belief where it's self-evident that it does apply to the universe in particular. But there are also a couple other positive evidences or arguments based on how we argue for the PSR in general that can be applied to aspect 2. And I should mention those, even though I avoided them as a worst case scenario to help out the skeptic or the atheist avoiding the Leibnizian cosmological argument. For the sake of Christians or others in the audience, you should know that there are other ways to establish aspect 2, that the PSR in general does apply to the universe. So the second way, besides a properly basic belief or self-evidence in that regard, is through the no violations, widespread violations of the PSR. You could create an inductive argument, perhaps, and reason, well, look, the PSR applies in general to existing things. The universe is an existing thing. In the absence of any justifications for an exemption or exception provided by the atheist as to why the universe, it shouldn't apply in the case of the universe, well, the universe is an existing thing like everything else, and inductively, therefore, since I see no violations and everything I know of the PSR applies to, every existing thing that I know of, the PSR applies to, therefore it applies to the universe. And that's an inductive argument that you could use. That's pretty strong. Again, I think I gave that 99.99%. You could, inductively assign your own probability for establishing aspect number 2 in general. And the second one, this is really strong, and it'll probably bump me up to 99.99% or more. But it's basically, remember that nature of modality argument. I realize we can apply this to prove aspect number 2 as well, because think of it, when that argument, I assigned a 95% to 100% on that, proven, but if it proves that there's a logical contradiction that comes from supposing it's logically possible that the universe could exist without an explanation. Well, that's logically impossible. So the logically equivalent is that, well, it's logically possible for the universe to exist with a cause. Not only that, it's also necessary, because the opposite, the universe coming to existence without a cause, is logically contradictory. It reduces to absurdity. Therefore, it's necessarily true that the universe in particular has the principle of sufficient reason applies in the case of the universe. In order for this argument to work in terms of aspect 2, you have to say, well, how confident are you that it's even logically possible? Just logically possible that the universe came into existence with a cause. And again, that's through our modal evaluating faculties and a properly basic belief through them. It's obviously logically possible. Come on, skeptics and atheists, you have to admit that it's possible that the universe came into existence with a cause. As a worst case scenario, I might give a 5% standard deviation to help out the atheist at most, to say maybe it's, if you want to deny this argument, you have to say that it's logically impossible. You have to argue that it's impossible for the universe in particular to come into existence with a cause. And I don't think you can do that. I mean, especially since we've seen that all the attempts of atheists in the negative evidences to try and prove that the universe constitutes a justified exemption or exception, then yeah, it's obviously logically possible that the universe came into existence with a cause. So yeah, this really puts the skeptic into a bind. Unless they can prove that it's impossible, that it's necessarily true that the universe comes into existence without an explanation or a cause, then this argument can be modified and actually proves through substituting the universe for the contingent thing coming in the argument, it proves that it's necessarily true that the universe has an explanation, including in the actual universe that we live in. So yeah, these are a couple different powerful ways you can also establish aspect 2, in addition to just using a properly based belief or self-evidence to get the 99%. So in actuality, yeah, covering these, I'll be well above 99.99. Possibly you might even assign it 100% based on one of these two ways of reasoning. So yeah,